The grandfather clock in the west wing of the Beaumont estate struck midnight, with a hollow resonance that seemed to linger in the marbled corridors. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the central air and the muffled rustle of curtains against tall windows. Richard Beaumont, billionaire, magnate, and a man who could bend entire industries with a signature, lay back against the velvet armrest of his chaise lounge, eyes closed, breath measured. To anyone peeking in, he looked asleep. But Richard wasn't sleeping. He was watching. For weeks now, a curiosity had been gnawing at him. His new maid, a quiet black woman named Lillian, had a young daughter who sometimes accompanied her in the evenings when childcare fell through. Richard, a man who prided himself on reading people, could not place the child. She was small, reserved, her dark eyes always scanning with a peculiar awareness, neither timid nor bold, but something else entirely. The girl fascinated him in a way he didn't like to admit. Tonight, Richard had staged the perfect test. He had fallen asleep in his study, leaving the door slightly ajar, knowing the child would wander past sooner or later. Would she touch things? Would she sneak, lie, misbehave? He wanted to see if her mother's values ran deep when no one was watching. The door creaked. Soft footsteps padded against the Persian rug. The billionaire's pulse quickened, though his face betrayed nothing. Through slitted lashes he caught sight of her, a small figure framed by the glow of the hallway light. She paused, watching him, then moved closer, as if drawn by something unsaid. Her tiny hands hovered near the leather-bound books, the crystal, decanter, the polished gold pen resting on his desk. And then she did something Richard did not expect. Something that made the hardened billionaire, a man unshaken by hostile boardrooms and ruthless takeovers, feel his chest constrict with disbelief. He froze, not from fear, not from anger, but from a realization so sharp it cut deeper than any betrayal or lie. What the girl did next would ripple through the household, the family, and Richard himself in ways no one could have foreseen. Richard Beaumont had never believed in fate, only in strategy. A billionaire who built his empire from a hedge fund. Startup in his 20s to a sprawling investment conglomerate by 40, Richard operated in a world where every move was calculated, every risk weighed. He was the kind of man who could sit silently at a boardroom table and make other men sweat with a single raised eyebrow. His estate mirrored that dominance, sprawling acres of manicured lawns, a mansion with wings that felt more like a museum than a home, and rooms so opulent that guests often paused at the threshold before stepping in. Every inch was curated. Oil paintings, rare antiques, and imported marble. Even the scent, subtle cedar wood and aged leather, seemed designed to remind visitors that they stood in the presence of legacy and power. But despite the grandeur, the mansion often felt empty. Richard lived alone, save for his staff. No wife, no children. Just echoes of footsteps on polished floors and the quiet hum of wealth sustaining itself. When Lillian Jacobs had applied for the live-in maid position 6 months ago, Richard hadn't even met her in person. His head housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, had vetted her thoroughly. A widow in her early 30s, Lillian was soft-spoken, efficient, and unfailingly polite. She moved through the house like a shadow, present but never intrusive. It was only after a month that Richard noticed the little girl. At first, he thought she was a neighbor's child visiting, but then he began seeing her more frequently, sitting quietly in the corner of the kitchen while Lillian prepped meals, or reading on the back steps while her mother polished silver. She was a delicate thing, no more than 6 or 7, with large expressive eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her. Her name was Amara. Richard had never spoken to her directly. He didn't need to. The girl seemed to sense when to keep her distance. She never touched anything, never made a sound out of turn. But she watched. Oh, how she watched. Her gaze was keen, curious, the kind that made Richard feel as if she were quietly assessing him, the way he did others. It unsettled him. One evening, he overheard Lillian gently admonishing her daughter in the laundry room. "Amara, baby, remember, this isn't our home. We're guests here. We respect Mr. Beaumont's things. We keep our hands to ourselves." See, that was when the idea took root. Richard wondered if the child's perfect behavior was just an act. He wondered if, when left alone, the girl would reveal something else, something hidden. He had seen it before, in adults, the way they transformed when they thought no one was watching, and so he devised his little test. That night, after dismissing most of the staff early, he made sure Lillian was occupied in the laundry wing. He left his study door ajar, reclined in the chaise lounge, and closed his eyes. He knew Amara would pass by on her way to the kitchen. He would pretend to sleep. And then he would know. Richard's breathing slowed, perfectly even, as if sleep had claimed him. Years of boardroom negotiations had taught him how to master his body language, to betray nothing even under scrutiny. He could sit motionless for hours, letting silence work as a weapon. Tonight, that skill became his disguise. Through half-closed lashes, he saw her enter. Amara's footsteps were feather-light on the rug, her small shadow stretching long across the study's vast floor. She paused by the door, peering into the dim space, her head cocked slightly as though she could sense his game. For a moment, Richard wondered if she truly believed he was asleep, or if, somehow, she knew. The girl drifted forward, not with the mischievous haste of a child exploring forbidden rooms, but with a strange, deliberate grace. She approached his desk first, where the crystal decanter caught the lamplight in amber hues. Her tiny fingers hovered above it, then curled back. She did not touch. She circled the desk, her gaze falling on the fountain pen Richard had received from a head of state as a gift. The pen was encrusted with a single diamond. Any child would have grabbed it, just to feel its weight. But Amara only leaned close, whispered something so faint Richard almost thought he imagined it. Then stepped back. Curiosity flared in him. What had she said? She crossed to the window next, where the curtains fluttered with the night breeze. She placed her palm flat on the glass and stared out at the moonlit gardens, lips moving in silent rhythm. Was she praying? Singing? Counting? Richard strained to hear, his mind sharpening as if decoding a riddle. Then, the moment that froze. Him came. Amara turned away from the window, walked toward him, and stopped just a foot from his chair. Richard's heart hammered, though his face remained slack. She studied him in silence, her big eyes scanning his face as if memorizing every detail. Then, to his astonishment, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a small folded scrap of paper, and placed it gently on the armrest beside his hand. Without a word, she stepped back, bowed her head slightly, a gesture eerily formal for a child, and padded out of the room. Richard waited until the sound of her footsteps faded before he cracked one eye fully open. The note sat there, small and unassuming. He unfolded it carefully. Written in uneven, childish handwriting were 6 words. "Don't be sad when you wake." Richard's chest tightened. He glanced around the study as if someone else had placed it there. But no, he had seen her do it. A child of 6 or 7 had written that. But why? What had she seen in him? The following morning, Richard could not concentrate. Numbers blurred on his laptop screen. Calls with executives felt hollow. His mind returned again and again to that note. That night, he caught himself lingering in the kitchen longer than usual, hoping to see Amara. Lillian was at the stove, stirring soup. "Mr. Beaumont?" she asked, surprised. "You usually dine in the study." "I'll eat here," Richard replied, lowering himself into a chair. That was when he noticed Amara again, sitting on the back steps, a small sketchbook balanced on her knees. She was drawing. When the breeze caught the page, Richard glimpsed what looked like him. His profile, sharp and distinct, captured, in pencil with startling accuracy for a child her age. "Your daughter draws," he remarked, keeping his tone casual. Lillian glanced over her shoulder and smiled faintly. "She always has. Helps her process things." "What kind of things?" Richard pressed. The maid hesitated. "Life," she said softly, as if that single word carried a world of meaning. For days after, Richard found himself watching Amara more closely. He noticed how she studied everyone, how she seemed to carry herself with quiet dignity, far beyond her years. He overheard her comforting one of the kitchen staff with words that sounded too wise for her age. He discovered her reading advanced books, volumes even his assistants struggled with. It unsettled him, fascinated him, drew him in. At night, when he sat in the dim study, Richard began to question himself. Why did this girl matter to him? Why did a billionaire who ruled boardrooms with iron precision find his thoughts tangled around a maid's child? And then, one evening, he overheard a truth that pierced deeper. Walking past the laundry room, he heard Amara's voice, soft, trembling. "Mama, do you think Mr. Beaumont is lonely?" Lillian's answer came with a sigh. "That man has everything. Don't worry about him." "But his eyes," Amara whispered, "they look sad when he thinks nobody sees." Richard froze in the hallway, his heart lurching. She had seen him, seen through him. A child had spotted the cracks in the armor that billionaires spent lifetimes polishing. From that night on, Richard's little test no longer felt like a game. It became an unraveling. The walls he had built for decades trembled each time the girl looked at him. Each time she drew him in her sketchbook. Each time she left, behind small notes or whispered phrases meant not to mock, not to deceive, but to heal. And Richard Beaumont, who once thought himself unshakable, began to feel something he hadn't in years: vulnerability. The night of the confrontation began. Like any other, Richard had retreated to his study after dinner, nursing a glass of whiskey, staring at spreadsheets he wasn't really reading. But his mind was elsewhere, on a folded note he kept tucked in his desk drawer, the one with Amara's uneven handwriting. He had tried to dismiss it, to shove it into the box where he stored all things inconvenient. Yet the words gnawed at him. "Don't be sad when you wake." Who was this child, to see him so clearly? He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, against the ache in his chest. That was when he heard it. Soft footsteps, the faintest creak of the door. He opened his eyes, not bothering to feign sleep this time. Amara stood in the doorway, sketchbook clutched against her chest. Her eyes widened at being caught. "You can come in," Richard said quietly, his voice lower, gentler than usual. She hesitated, then stepped inside. The vastness of the room seemed to swallow her small frame. She stopped a few feet away, watching him as if gauging whether it was safe. "What do you have there?" Richard asked, nodding at the sketchbook. Amara lowered her gaze. "Just drawings. May I see?" Another pause. Then, slowly, she crossed the room and handed it to him. Her fingers brushed his, light as a feather. Richard opened the worn book and felt his breath catch. Pages upon pages of pencil sketches stared back at him. Some were of the mansion, its towering staircases, chandeliers, and gardens. Some were of her mother, drawn with remarkable tenderness. But scattered among them were drawings of Richard himself, his profile by the window, his hand gripping a pen, his face when he thought no one was watching, and each sketch carried the same haunting detail: his eyes, sad, distant, heavy. Richard swallowed hard. "Why do you draw me like this?" Amara shifted uncomfortably. "Because it's true." Her voice was so soft, yet it cut sharper than any boardroom insult. Richard closed the sketchbook, setting it carefully on the desk. For the first time in years, he felt exposed, not as a billionaire, not as a figure of power, but as a man. "Does your mother know you see things this way?" he asked. Amara shook her head. "Mama says people don't like it when I notice too much." Before Richard could respond, a new voice came from the doorway. "She's right." Lillian stood there, arms crossed, her expression a mixture of worry and protectiveness. She stepped into the room, her gaze shifting from her daughter to her employer. "Mr. Beaumont," she began, her voice steady, "I don't know what game you've been playing with my child, but I won't have her used." Richard stiffened. "I've done nothing to harm her." "You've been watching her, testing her." Lillian's tone sharpened. "Do you think I don't notice? Amara tells me everything. She may be young, but she sees through people in ways that frighten them. That's why we keep to ourselves." Richard rose slowly from his chair, towering but not threatening. "I wasn't mocking her. I needed to know if what I thought I saw was real." "And what did you see?" Lillian challenged. He looked at Amara, who stood clutching her mother's hand now, wide-eyed but unafraid. "I saw honesty," Richard said at last. "I saw more truth in a child's eyes than I've seen in grown men all my life." Silence stretched between them. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock. Finally, Amara spoke. "You're lonely." The words fell like stones in a still pond, rippling outward. Richard's throat tightened. He opened his mouth, to deny it, to hide behind the walls of wealth and pride, but nothing came. For the first time in decades, Richard Beaumont had no words. Instead, he sat back down heavily, rubbing his temple. "Maybe I am," he admitted, his voice breaking just enough for both mother and daughter to hear. Lillian's expression softened. She had worked for many men in her life, men of wealth, men of pride, but she had never seen one lay down his armor so completely. "Mr. Beaumont," she said quietly, "Amara doesn't mean harm. She just sees what people try to bury. It's her gift, and her burden." Richard looked at the girl, who met his gaze with steady innocence. Not pity, not judgment, just recognition. And for the first time in years, Richard Beaumont felt seen. Truly seen. For hours after that night's confrontation, Richard could not sleep. He lay awake in the dark, staring at the carved ceiling beams above his bed, hearing Amara's words replay like an echo he could not silence. "You're lonely." The statement wasn't cruel, nor was it meant as an insult. It was simply truth, laid bare by a child with unflinching honesty. And it rattled him more than any hostile takeover, any lawsuit, any betrayal in his long, ruthless career. He had spent decades surrounding himself with things: luxury, art, staff, investments, all designed to affirm that he had won the game of life. But in the silence of his estate, where chandeliers glowed for no one and meals were prepared for a single man, Richard began to wonder, had he really won? The next morning, he found himself lingering in the breakfast room, where Lillian quietly set the table. Amara sat beside her, sketchbook open, drawing something in silence. Normally, Richard would have eaten alone in his study, but instead, he cleared his throat. "May I join you?" he asked. Lillian looked up, startled, but nodded. "Of course, sir." He sat across from them, feeling oddly out of place at his own table. Amara looked up briefly, then back to her drawing. "What are you working on?" Richard asked. She tilted the book toward him. It was a sketch of the estate's gardens, but, in her drawing, sunlight streamed through storm clouds, illuminating flowers in bloom. "Beautiful," Richard murmured, and something inside him shifted. In the weeks that followed, change came slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Richard began taking breakfast with Lillian and Amara more often. He started noticing little things he had long ignored. The laughter of the staff in the kitchen, the way sunlight warmed the marble floors, the simple joy in watching Amara chase butterflies across the lawn. For the first time, the mansion felt less like a fortress and more like a home. One evening, Richard stood at the window of his study, watching Amara and her mother walk hand in hand through the gardens. He thought about the note she had left. Him, "Don't be sad when you wake." It was not just a child's comfort. It was a challenge, a plea. Lillian joined him at the window, folding laundry in her arms. "You've changed?" she said softly. "Have I?" Richard asked. She gave a small smile. "You listen more. You look people in the eye. You smile, even if you don't realize it." Richard exhaled, the weight in his chest both heavier and lighter at once. "Your daughter. She's remarkable." "She is," Lillian agreed, pride flickering in her gaze. "But she's still a child, Mr. Beaumont. She needs protection. She needs to be allowed to just be." "I understand," Richard nodded, and he did, more than ever before. That night, Richard made a decision. The next morning, he gathered the staff in the main hall and announced new policies, better hours, higher pay, opportunities for their families. But most of all, he made it clear. This estate was not just a house of wealth, but a place where lives mattered. When he finished, he caught Amara watching him from the staircase, her eyes steady, approving in that quiet, knowing way. And for once, Richard Beaumont did not feel like a man on display. He felt human. Weeks turned to months. Richard still ran his empire, still sat at the head of boardroom tables. But behind his sharp words and iron will, something had softened. The note remained in his desk drawer, not as a wound, but as a compass. He no longer pretended to sleep. He no longer needed to test others. Instead, he found himself tested daily by the presence of a child who reminded him of something wealth had never bought: truth. And when he looked in the mirror, his eyes no longer seemed quite so lonely.